Coming up, the New York Football Giants concluded Hard Knocks, focusing in on the draft, where we now know that Joe Schoen had several opportunities to choose different paths. What does it mean for Big Blue in the short term? And how much of a defining season could this be for this regime and this franchise? We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your host. Over here, Adam Arbrecht, over there, Andrew Mackwitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise, and we're talking about the New York Football Giants. Hard Knocks wraps up. There's some very specific stuff, Andy, that we want to talk about, really beyond Hard Knocks when it comes to the choices that Joe Schoen and the Giants made, not only in the draft, but this offseason overall. But quickly, on a high level, how'd you feel about Hard Knocks overall?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting the amount of access that we actually got in this. I was not expecting to see a lot of the things that we did see, for good and for bad. The last episode, they showed the entire Giants big board in the background, and they actually didn't blur it out. You could see every name of who was picked, and also they had it all color coordinated, Adam. So you saw, Doug Analytics on Twitter X came out and thinks that he deciphered what the different colors represented on the big board.
Sure.
Injury concerns, off-field problems, versatility in different positions, all those different things. I was shocked that the Giants allowed that to be aired to show exactly how they felt about all these different prospects that they did not draft.
It is an interesting aspect to it. There was Tommy, who does a good job over on Twitter X as well, and works, I believe, covering with SI in some capacity. He mentioned about like body language of Brian Dable when they said, all right, so, and then if that doesn't work out, we'll go with Daniel Jones and we'll get him a weapon. And his reaction and whether or not that was conveying some, self-defeated element to the way Brian Dable was thinking about the season ahead. And he might be right, he might be wrong. And it does fall into that category of, when you allow some access like this, what things are you thinking about actively as an organization? What things are you maybe overlooking? Do you maybe not realize that, well, even if the names had been blurred out, if you have yellow, red, green, orange, purple, brown, like at some point you can start to break those down a little bit. Maybe it doesn't ultimately matter in the end, but everyone had kind of had that speculation around, what are we going to walk away from here in the first iteration of this version of Hard Knocks, where you're kind of getting into some of the nuts and bolts. I still feel like there were enough times when it felt performative in terms of what they were doing and conversations that were being had, where I like high level takeaways from this, but I don't know if I was thrilled with Joe Schoen kind of becoming like the minor celebrity coverage of the New York Football Giants. It was interesting from that standpoint. We've never seen that from a GM, perspective, especially from Hard Knocks. It's about coaches, players, and the decisions that they make. You usually don't get it from the guy that made all the decisions and set the team up for the year ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Schoen walks out of this and everyone unanimously thinks that he is a nice guy, right? Like watching that, you're like, Joe Schoen, nice guy. Probably great at a barbecue. Would love to hang out with him and be friends with him. I think what this we talked about this on the last episode in terms of like I had my doubts when it came to free agency and how they kind of missed the mark on some of the different valuations that they had for certain players. And you kind of look at the plan that the Giants had and you think, did they go best player available? Was that the philosophy that they had, or did they actually just draft for needs? And that seems to be the sentiment that a lot of people have on social media right now. All the fans are coming back saying, well, it doesn't seem like, if we were going best player available, that doesn't seem like how the board shook out for us. Instead, we replaced Saquon Barkley with Tyrone Tracy. We replaced Xavier McKinney with Tyler Nubin. There's a whole host of things that you can go down the list and say, they just had areas of need and they filled them. Whether you think that's philosophically right or wrong, that's my takeaway from it.
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to get into here, because there's enough going on, and it does include the offseason, the choice, as Ryan Dunleavy was pointing out over on X, to you go and sign Brian Burns via trade. You give up a pick, so you don't have 39th overall in the draft, and then you also don't have that money to spend in other areas. But then we get into the draft itself. So I think every single pick here, walking through the first two and then even into the third round with the way that they discussed Drew Phillips. So there are positives here on Drew Phillips, on Theo Johnson, and on Tyrone Tracy Jr., which I think all three players represented guys that the Giants liked and had earmarked. However, right there at the top, so this is, if you want to tie it into the sentiment around Daniel Jones and how they feel about him, you're sitting there at the 6th overall pick. The Jets, you hear a call from Douglas, but they don't really get into any details about what it is. They're going to be happy to pick. However, though, they do let you into the war room, and that the Indianapolis Colts call, and they offer the 15th overall pick, the 46th overall pick, and then a 2025 second. Now, whether or not they could have negotiated up from there a little bit more and gotten something extra, that was at least the baseline package that they let in the door. When you take a look at that, does it feel like Joe Schoen, a GM who in years past, that he mentioned, I traded up, I traded down. This year they stood pat. They sat there and they took the players that they had available to them with the 6 picks. In that moment, would you take the step back and go, hey, we get how electric a player like Malik Neighbors can be for us, but there's some value, there's some real value and some real intrigue around maybe backing up in the first round a little and picking up extra draft capital. Would you have entertained that from the Colts in that moment?
No, I think Joe Schoen was pretty spot on the way that he analyzed that. Obviously you have to listen. It seems almost like Joe Schoen was acting like what the Patriots were acting to Joe Schoen when he called to say, "Hey, what do you think about moving up for the 3rd pick?" And they basically said we would need to be overwhelmed to move out of it. I think Joe Schoen was always listening to those offers, but I don't think he was ever really seriously going to move that far back unless they were offering their 1st round pick next year or something. When you look at who went in that 15 to 19 range, you're talking about a bunch of edge rushers, defensive tackle, offensive tackle, and one guard from 15 to 20. Those really weren't what the Giants were looking for. They needed a playmaker. They needed a potential quarterback. They needed a cornerback. None of those players were really in that range. So I agree with Joe Schoen. It didn't really make sense what the Colts were offering. They weren't blown away. So you stick there and you take a guy like Malik Neighbors, who so far in training camp looks to be the right choice.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about a guy like Brock Bowers who ends up going to the Raiders at 13, right? So you're even a little bit ahead of them there in the 15 range. You talk about the Jets being in the discussions or at least making the phone call, obviously, because to me, when you talk about going back to 15, almost to your point, well, you'd have to go down to, and maybe you could have sold, the fan base or yourself on the idea of a Quinyon Mitchell who goes 22nd to the Eagles, or looking at Terrion Arnold who goes to Detroit there at 24, right? So there's a version of this where you reach back to get that cornerback, and we'll talk about the 2nd round and how that unfolded. The other side of it is, if you were thinking about quarterback, because there's one wrinkle here, the Malik Neighbors, by the way, Joe Schoen said it. He goes, well, if for some reason the Chargers don't go offensive lineman, which we assume they're going to do, and they choose to go weapon because they lost guys in the wide receiver spot, then we'll go ahead. Like, they were ready to take, it seemed like, Rome Odunze at 6 if it wasn't going to be Malik Neighbors. So the sentiment seems to be we were locked into the idea of taking a weapon here, mostly because the quarterbacks were going to be gone ahead of them, and there wasn't really a lot. They showed J.J. McCarthy on Hard Knocks up there when the Giants were picking at 6 and, some of the things that were happening, but they never discussed them at any point, because that's the only way where I think maybe the trade back could have made sense there, where you say, if I go with the Jets down to 10, or even if I go back to 15, I could still turn around and walk myself back up the board if I want to, with enough QB needy teams in the mix there around JJ McCarthy. And obviously it ends up being the trade there with the Vikings. But it's interesting to think about the Jets willing and looking to come up the board, presumably for an offensive lineman. And then ultimately they end up taking a step back there, still getting their tackle, and then allowing the Vikings to go up the board. So you'd have to have convinced me that the Giants believed in this QB class in totality, not just in maybe getting a couple of the unreachables, because Bo Nix would have been there as well. The Giants weren't in those waters for those players.
Yeah, the only other scenario that made sense to me, Adam, was if they thought they could get Rome Odunze at 12 or 13 or something like that, and they had to give up a little bit of draft capital to move up a couple spots. But they actually nailed the entire first 10 picks. When we saw in Hard Knocks them going through their strategy of like where players are going to fall, what we think, if Marvin Harrison Jr. or Malik Neighbors is there, we're going to turn in the card right away. There are scenarios where if both of those guys are gone, we could trade back to 9 and maybe still get Rome Odunze. Like, they had it pegged pretty well. And it just felt like 15 was going to be too far for them to get an impact player. If they really wanted a wide receiver, you're talking about Brian Thomas Jr., Malik Neighbors' running mate. Doesn't get as exciting when you hear and you see what everyone was talking about with Malik Neighbors.
two other ways that I just think about this is, one, if you traded back, if you had gone with the trade back, then it would have been, for me, it would have been the double down. I trade back to 15 and then I'm still open for business at 15 and I trade down again. And I'm really thinking about, I want to have a cache of assets for next year's draft when I need to move up to go get my quarterback, or I want to continue to fill in, some spots here. We know first year when Joe Schoen came in, they had a slew of draft picks throughout every single round. This time around, just the 6 picks. So can I get to 9 picks in this draft? Do I think the value is there? Do I prepare for the future? The other thing would be, again, we talk about weapons and needing them. And Joe Schoen mentioned, hey, we see how much the wide receivers are going for on the market. The only other thing you could think about here is sitting there and saying, and especially with the way this offseason is unfolded and the state of Evan Neal and signing Van Rooten, who I've been calling Van Rotten for quite some time, but I've corrected myself. Thank you to everybody in the YouTube comments. Is going with, was Latham a worthwhile pick? Would that have looked like something different for your offensive line in totality, or the trade back and then looking at those options when you work your way through the first round, right? And you still have to talk about like a Fuaga who goes there 14th, just ahead of where the Giants maybe would have been. Mims, the Bengals take him at 18. So, do you look at any of those possibilities and say we can strengthen our offensive line? That's not, I'm not sitting here saying, oh, they should have done that. But when you see the way the offseason is going and some of the questions getting asked around who's playing where and needing to bring in another player, I can give myself that perspective. If we dial back to the offseason in totality and where money was allocated, was there one more move or decision to get made there?
Well, then it opens up the question of, are we confident that the Giants are good at drafting offensive linemen? Are we confident that this regime can nail the pick and actually do what they need to? Look at the track record of the draft picks that Joe Schoen and company have done on the offensive line, and look at where it's gotten them. Literally, Evan Neal, now injured. Looks like, we'll get into it in a little bit about the reshaping of the offensive line. Doesn't look to be part of the starting rotation, and it was a top 10 pick. Then you have guys like John Michael Schmitz, who underperformed, is injured right now at center. We thought he was a can't miss, set it and forget it type of prospect. You look at Marcus McCathan, you look at Joshua Azudu, you look at all these guys that can't even break into the lineup. They're fringe rotational guys. Give me a guy like Malik Neighbors, who everyone is turning around saying he's dynamic, he's explosive, he's unbelievable. He feels like the can't miss prospect. If you went with an offensive lineman, I'm not even confident that the Giants were going to be able to develop him into something that would actually work for the Giants.
Took one at 7 a couple of years ago. That didn't pan out. How confident are we at 6? That was the difference, though. If we were just one spot higher, it would have all worked out. Coming up here in a second, though, what I'll make the case was even more interesting about draft day, and that's going to the second round, where the board stood, the type of players the Giants wanted, and whether or not Joe Schoen was too trigger shy in a moment to maybe go improve that secondary. We'll get into that coming up here in just one moment. As we continue our OGP episode live on YouTube. We've done a couple of these this week now. Did it yesterday as well. Everyone get in the comments. Had a really good time with it. A reminder that you can go look in the show notes, or if you're watching on YouTube, feel free to scan the code. Join the club. We have a few different tiers, bonus perks, things we're building towards as we get towards that regular season. Always an opportunity to be more involved with OGP. We appreciate you. So go ahead if you so choose to do that. Now, we talk about that top of the first round. Listen, Malik Neighbors is all over Hard Knocks, so you know that Brian Daboll really wanted him, wanted the weapon. You can make the case with Wan'Dale Robinson, even with Jalen Hyatt, that the Giants have actually shown they're pretty good at that part of it, finding some wide receiver talent, so you love it. They set it and forget it. Here's where it becomes more interesting, though, and why it ties back to the offseason. Okay, you want to go make that big splash trade. You want to go get Brian Burns. You're going to lose one of your second-round picks that you had acquired. And when you go look at the way this draft board unfolded, it is pretty fascinating, because they're at 39th. It ends up being Fisk, the defensive lineman, going to the Rams. That doesn't matter. It's the fact that 2 players that they talk about in Hard Knocks, in Kool-Aid McKinstry, and then the man that you were interested in Kamari Lassiter, were 2 cornerbacks that they really liked. And at least seemed to me, Andy, that they were sitting there coming into it going like, hey, we're really in a good spot here. Like, we're going to get one of our guys that we want. Nothing to worry about. This is the first time when I go, okay, what are you not seeing here about what other teams are looking to do, where they're prioritizing certain positions, and how that board unfolds? Because not only those 2 players, they don't mention these guys as well, but at 40, it was Cooper DeJean, obviously going there. You also had Max Melton, a player that I was a fan of out of Rutgers. He goes at 43. So that run on the cornerback room happens. And even though the Giants, we saw Shane Bowen, they call him over, they say, hey, you're happy with Newman? He goes, oh yeah, really happy to get Newman. That's awesome. But when you tell me that you wanted to get that cornerback across from Tay Banks and you don't at all, by the way, then you end up getting a cornerback. We'll talk about Phillips. That was the first kind of alarm bell. We went, okay, did you just kind of get snaked here and let the board get run away from you basically by other teams that were more aggressive?
Yeah, I mean, watching that back, Adam, and you know my affinity for Kamari Lassiter. Obviously, I profiled him a few times during the draft. I said second round is the area to target.
Yep.
And Adam, when Joe Schoen said that, I was like, that's refreshing. Like one of the guys that I had circled and
Always
highlighted.
feels good, right? Yeah, always feels good.
Give myself a little pat on the back for that
Yeah.
one. But he was gone, and the couple things that I thought about at that exact moment were one, if they had found a way to give their later second round pick in the Brian Burns trade, they would have had either Kool-Aid McKinstry or Kamari Lassiter with that 39th selection.
Yep.
Unfortunately, they didn't. So they end up getting Tyler Nubin. And obviously they painted it with rose-colored glasses like, oh, we wanted Tyler Nubin. He was the guy that we definitely needed. I have a question for you, Adam.
Hey,
what do you think if Tyler Nubin went the pick right before the Giants, who are the Giants drafting? Like at that moment, it's like cornerbacks are gone, safeties are gone, best player of it. Like where do you think the Giants go at that point? We didn't even hear another name other than Tyler Nubin.
Yeah, I don't think you're looking at the cornerback out of Michigan because again, like that target area there, Max Melton name didn't get mentioned. He went ahead of the Giants anyway at 47. When you go down the list, I mean, do you maybe start to talk about, Ben Sinnott, the tight end out of Kansas? That's really high in the second round. We know they wanted to target and value that position, but I'm like running through it as to your point, as you get yourself down into the late 50s and towards the 60s. I mean, there's safety and Cole Bishop out of Utah, not the same caliber of a prospect as Nubin was. Maybe you flip it over and start to think about edge rusher and, have that discussion. What does it mean for a guy like Azeez Ojulari? You've already made that trade. It is interesting. And then guys like Rakestraw still in the cornerback room, but now I'm getting into the 60s. And I do wonder, maybe to your point, if not for him being there, and I don't know what other teams would have done, if Joe Schoen would have been kind of opening up the phone lines and saying, anybody looking for something here? You need an offensive lineman? You need an edge rusher? Because our positional value is shifting here pretty dramatically. And we can't sit here now at 47 and take player X when on our board, he's 15, 20 slots back for us right now.
Yeah, Javon Bullard at 58 went to the Packers. He was the number one overall safety on ESPN's big board. He's probably someone that the Giants could have targeted if they didn't want Tyler Nubin. We talk about how there's not that much depth around the defensive tackle position.
Yeah.
There's Chris Jenkins and a few other guys. Chris Jenkins.
Oh, Jenkins, that's right. He's a guy that I'd highlighted. I liked his pedigree, right? That's good.
Yep, exactly. And so that would have felt pretty uninspiring in the second round to take a defensive tackle, though. When you need a cornerback, that you need safety help, you need to replace Saquon Barkley, and you're doubling up on the position where you feel like you have one of the best players in the league, Dexter Lawrence, it would have been uninspired. But that's my point. It felt like that was the first time that we got a peek behind the curtain where the Giants really didn't get their first or their second choice. Tyler Nubin was their third, and obviously we're happy to have him, but it felt like that was the first time where you're like, man, if the Brian Burns trade went a little different, the entire second and third rounds would have looked drastically different for the Giants.
And now we're going to talk about Drew Phillips, Theo Johnson, and also Tracy Jr. as well. But it's interesting too, because again, in Hard Knocks, it gets covered. Fourth rounder is what Joe Schoen mentioned in terms of needing to move up there in the second round if they wanted to get that cornerback. And he again framed it as, unlike in years past when I had so many picks, but we only had our 6. So you got to let the board talk to you. I hate that phrase, because saying let the board talk to you, it's just, that means let everybody else make their picks. And then when it comes to your pick, you look at the board and you see if there's a guy that you like, they're like, who's our best option here? It's okay to go best player available, but like the board speaking to you, it's not like,
let the board come to you feels like pick who's ever available when it's your turn to pick. You're like, right. I don't, that doesn't seem like a strategy that I would implore, but sure.
Yeah. Joe. And so that's a little bit, that's the part of it that's interesting. And it's not a knock on Nubin. When they talked to Bowen, he said day one contributor, right? It's not a knock on that. And it's not a knock on Theo Johnson, who I really like. And they talked about him a lot. And we got excited when he was coming up on the board and we were looking at the tight end room. However, if you told me that not getting Theo Johnson, which maybe you end up going to the market, free agency or something, we know the retirement, obviously, and what that room currently looks like. If that meant going and getting a starting cornerback across from Tay Banks, I got to tell you, at least on a high level, I'd be looking in this training camp going, well, we already know Banks is a stud. And now we feel like, hey, we plugged in another elite high-end talent across from him. Cordell Flott, could it work out? Could it not? We'll wait and see here. But that is it. And again, to come back to what the Giants wanted to accomplish versus what they did accomplish, it doesn't mean you can't like the picks that they made and like those players. But boy, if you're telling me you went in saying in the first 2 rounds, we maybe wanted a quarterback, couldn't get there for him. We got the weapon that we wanted. And then the number 2 most important thing we want to do is get another player in that secondary on the outside specifically. And it just kind of goes by the wayside. That one kind of stung for me.
Yeah, and Neil in the comments said wouldn't have been surprised if Newman had gone, if they would have stretched and drafted Phillips in that spot, which would have been even worse than potentially going for a defensive tackle or something, saying, we're not going with the best players available. There's 15 better players, but we really need this nickel cornerback, and you do it in the second round. That would have felt like an unmitigated disaster to me. So I'm glad that wasn't the case.
No, and one other thing here. So I want to get into now the Drew Phillips, the Theo Johnson, and the Tyrone Tracy Jr. of it all. But taking a look here as we step away and go, what could this offseason have looked like? The Brian Burns acquisition is incredible, but in totality, where do we stand when we look at this team? Let's get into the back end of this draft class coming up here in just one moment. Reminder, as we continue our discussion about not only Hard Knocks, but the Giants offseason, the draft, what did they accomplish? And I'm going to tell you right now, this feels make or breaky for Joe Schoen and this regime. We do remind you today's episode is brought to you by Pietential, Pietential. Pietential.com is a free for individual users online assessment tool, sets a baseline for your well-being, gives you tools to improve over time, and tracks your progress as well. It's a great way to make sure that if you're Joe Schoen and you're coming out of this offseason a little bit shaky, keep yourself on an even keel. Go check it out today on Pietential.com. All right. So it unfolds the way it unfolds, and we'll circle back to this draft in totality in the offseason. What is nice about it is the way that they talked about Drew Phillips. This wasn't a conversation about, well, let's see kind of where we're at here. They viewed him as, and Shane Bowen again gets referenced in Hard Knocks, a 3-down player, instant contributor again, a guy that they believe has the mental IQ, the toughness. They show a little interview, cut with him as well. This does feel like for whatever didn't work out in the first 2 rounds, coming up at 70, it felt like the Giants, unless you think that they were narrative building, it felt like the Giants were like, oh, okay, great. We didn't get an outside guy, but we really like this player, and we feel like we're getting a good value at 70.
Well, first question that I have for you is, if the Giants had Kool-Aid McKinstry or Kamari Lassiter there in the second round, is Drew Phillips the pick in the third round?
No, of course not. I would assume. I mean, unless you're going full overhaul, like you assume you're going to pivot your needs to somewhere else. Yeah,
right. Then you don't re-sign Darnay Holmes. You don't re-sign some of the guys that you have inside the building. Again, listen, when you hear Brian Daboll interviewing Drew Phillips and he's sitting on the couch, he's like, "What do you hang your hat on?" He's like, "I am not scared of anyone." I looked at Drew Phillips. I'm like, that man is not scared of anyone. I looked into his eyes and everything he said was absolutely true. And I was like, I am glad that this guy is on our team. So that piece of it made me excited. Obviously, he is a tenacious, hardworking, gritty type guy, and the toughness is never going to be questioned with Drew Phillips. It just feels like the Giants went to plan B and maybe even plan C when thinking about who they were going to draft in the second and the third round. So while we can be excited that these players are New York Giants now, looking back, you're kind of like, man, they had a bunch of contingency plans, because whatever plan A was, if plan A was drafting a quarterback, and trading up in the third round, that went by the wayside. Plan B was to get a cornerback in the second round. That went by the wayside. And plan C is in the third round, picking up a nickel corner instead of an outside guy. Yeah. It feels like the Giants maybe didn't get their preferred path in any of the first 3 rounds.
And so the one note, because I'll make here at 73, and you could even say 71 right behind the Giants, it's Isaiah Adams, interior offensive lineman at Illinois. But we talked about Cooper Beebe out of Kansas State a lot leading up to the draft. He goes at 73. So when you ask the question, if you get your cornerback in the second round, where would you have gone? Well, again, think about the offseason, even signing those players. If you told me now that Illuminor, which is where he is now, playing right tackle for the New York Football Giants, was going to be moved there, maybe you go and you look at that interior offensive line, depending on how you feel, just as a name to mention. But it's to your point. Is this second and third option good? Did it work out? Were the Giants maybe? I mean, listen, paint a picture where the Giants do take Drew Phillips after getting the outside corner, and all of a sudden you look at the Giants secondary and it's Tay Banks along with Kool-Aid McKinstry and with Drew Phillips, and you just go, we rebuilt the secondary. Because by the way, that's one of the weakest points. And I think it expands back to the offseason decision, trading for and paying Brian Burns, because not only did you lose an extra pick here, which would have given you some wiggle room, because we're talking about, well, if they'd given up the later second round pick, well, what if they had just had both those picks and could have made different choices about that? They could have been picking at both those spots if they had just gone out to the open market and signed offensive lineman X or defensive player Y. Names were mentioned there that didn't cost anything in terms of trading for it. It was just the dollars on the market. The Giants could have had 39 and 47 and then come to 70 and made different choices. But let's continue on. Theo Johnson ends up being the player that they get in the fourth round. They're high on him. They like him. It's a lot of the raw measurables. He's a big guy. And I'll add in Tyrone Tracy Jr. here as well, because you got no conversation about coming up in the second round, some speculation, would the Giants go running back? They didn't talk about it at all. Now, they knew that it was going to go that way and names were going to come off the board, but they believe that they found some flexibility in the position value with where the run was going to go and who they're going to get. Those two players, the later round picks, how do you feel about it? Let's compartmentalize what didn't happen, but getting those players, did it look like the Giants identified them fourth and fifth round as these are guys that maybe we see the value that people don't?
Yeah, that was an interesting way that they spun it with Tyrone Tracy, and they were like, everyone looked at the negatives and like he hasn't played the position all that much. He's on the older side, and Brandon Brown, the assistant GM, turned it around and said, "Well, like what we saw in the limited amount of time, he looked explosive." And the analytics team backed up everything that their eyes saw. When I hear that they had like an inkling that this guy could be great, could be special, and they uncovered something that other teams didn't see, and then the analytics and advanced analytics back up what their eyes are telling them, that to me is a good process that they went through to get Tyrone Tracy.
Yes.
He was not on your radar. He wasn't on my radar. But clearly the Giants were like, we could get him in the fourth round, or we could wait because we've done our due diligence and we can get Theo Johnson and Tyrone Tracy because we have done our due diligence on the running back spot. So for me, I was very excited to see the methodology that the Giants went through on those later round picks.
Yeah, that I thought was the biggest example of trusting your board, trusting your scouts. And they went through a really good list when it came to Theo Johnson, mentioning some other players, Justin Tuck in the third round, Bavaro, right? They throw out some of these Giants mid-late round gems that went on to Pro Bowl and Hall of Fame careers. You're like, okay, like let's cook a little bit here. And it's interesting because those players, you go, because of where they're selected, there's not as much pressure for them to be hits, but you go, oh, okay, it looks like you really found your way and navigated to it. And that's where I think, to close out, the compartmentalization to me overall was, yes, in the later rounds, because all teams are probably doing this, scouting guys you like, that you think you see something other teams don't, analytics, putting all the pieces together. But in the earlier rounds, when it's about guys that you're targeting and players that you want, it seems like the Giants maybe got caught a little bit behind the eight ball on, if we want these players, we need to be willing to go get them. So when we step back and think about, you sign Brian Burns in the offseason, you sign Runyon Jr., you sign Illuminor. Let's also say that you sign, boy, we're getting to the weeds here now. Not Rotten, maybe Rutan, maybe Roten. We're gonna drill down on this offensive lineman. Let's put him in the mix here as well, though, right? Would you have preferred that this was a team that did not have Brian Burns on it, that maybe had, let's leave all the offensive lineman additions as they stand, and they go and get another friend of Dexter Lawrence to put there on the interior of this defensive front, and you walk into this draft where you could have had the same conversation. We're taking McKinstry at 39. We're still taking Tyler Nubin at 47 if we want to, and still taking a player X, Y, or Z as you come up at 70. Do you have any sense of, I would have done this different if I was at the helm for the Giants this offseason?
I think that the Giants gave up a lot for Brian Burns, not only in draft capital that clearly would have been useful to get that cornerback that you mentioned, but also the salary cap space. They gave such a big deal to Brian Burns that this is Joe Schoen's legacy. That move for Brian Burns is his legacy. People could say it's Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones is whether or not the team is going to be successful, but the swing that Joe Schoen just made with Brian Burns will make or break his tenure as the general manager of the Giants, right?
Well, yes, and let's expand this thing out, because I think Daniel Jones is, the one step removed, but obviously that contract mattered when you did that. But and then you didn't bring back Saquon Barkley this offseason. We're not saying we disagree with it, but you didn't do that. You didn't bring back Xavier McKinney this offseason. We're not saying we disagree with it, but you didn't do that. Like, we are now, these last one big decision with Daniel Jones and this offseason, like this does feel like, and you mentioned at the top, do we trust this regime in drafting offensive linemen? Well, he went out in free agency to fix that problem. This very much, I did not think that this upcoming season was really going to be make or break because it's still Daniel Jones at quarterback and you're just trying to improve the team. But because of the active choices, especially trading for Brian Burns and the capital and what happened in the draft, I actually do think that like we're going to be midway through this season, probably doing some evaluation and assessing whether or not we think Joe Schoen has been strong enough, especially in the draft, to warrant not being on the hot seat as you work your way through what's still a rebuilding process, but we got to see the hits more than we see the misses.
Yeah, and Adam, the other thing I saw online, people were talking about, they were debating whether or not Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen are on the hot seat coming into this year. And Warren Sharp of Sharp Analytics, good follow on Twitter X, he came back and was like, this is ludicrous. I can't believe you would even say it. Look at what he's had to deal with. Look at the quarterback that he had to deal with, all this other stuff. And we pointed out very simply, it should be a little bit warm right now because Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll co-signed giving another deal to Daniel Jones. That wasn't Dave Gettleman that gave him the 4-year contract, right? It was Brian Daboll who was the one that got in a fight with his defensive coordinator publicly and had a whole falling out through the media of like who's trying to do what mutiny. It was Brian Daboll who took play calling abilities away from his offensive coordinator. And now the offense coordinator almost took a lateral move with the Seattle Seahawks to get out of here. So when I think about, do I like Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen? I said, yes, I like them. You can tell that Brian Daboll is a brilliant, football mind. But to think that, you look at this Hard Knocks situation, you see the free agent decisions that they made, you see how the draft went. This is a huge, huge season for the two of them. And if things get off to a rocky start, I wouldn't be surprised if the larger national media starts saying, we need to take a second look at whether or not this combination is working for the Giants. I am hopeful, but at the end of the day, Adam, it didn't seem like they got plan A executed in the offseason, and that has me having a few concerns.
Yeah, I think you have to look at this upcoming season. It may not be about wins and losses per se. Like, I don't think that you or I believe that that's how the seat gets hot for either Joe Schoen or Brian Daboll, but it will be hot around, were these the right draft picks? Was it right to not go get player X in free agency? How does Runyon and Illuminor and now adding another player into this mix? By the way, making up for the miss on Evan Neal, whether or not everyone consensus agreed it was a good pick at the time, it hasn't panned out. So there's a lot of things here that at least are going to make you scratch your head if we're halfway through the year and we don't feel like certain players, Cordell Flott included in that now, is coming along and finding roles for themselves. So it is fascinating. I would say, we started at the top by how do we feel about Hard Knocks? What sense did we like and little looks behind the curtain and all those things. It's all good. It's all interesting, but I wouldn't say that I come out of 5 episodes to whatever degree we got to see behind the inner workings of the New York Giants organization and feel bolstered by what I saw. It didn't embolden me to say, oh, Joe Schoen is 100% the man to fix this organization going forward. It made me go, maybe. Maybe that'll work out. And there's certainly a bravado and confidence to Brian Daboll. I will give him that. But he's interesting too. Like, he seems to be as cool as can be about everything that's going on, which is probably a positive. But it's fascinating, man. And we're not going to know it maybe until the regular season. But we have training camp. We have preseason games. Those things are going to be fascinating, to say the least. I will, as Andy had thrown this up here, just shout out Neil one time, because Tracy Jr. and Turbo Miller, who's getting some hype in camp as well, could both be diamonds in the rough this season. I agree with you. Like, all of a sudden, we may turn around in weeks 2 and week 3 and say, oh, look what they did. Some signings, some draft picks, all these things come together and you see the footsteps of success going forward. But because of the up and down over the last 2 years, that's what makes it feel like little conversation about seats and how hot they are, depending on how things start out. I like to always close out episodes by really dialing up just kind of the filibuster and not letting Andy get a word in edgewise. The bottom line is, guys, over on YouTube, as we've mentioned, you can follow us. We're doing some lives like you're seeing right now today. You can go ahead and dial in the show notes or by scanning the code here and join the membership group with bonus perks that we're going to be unrolling throughout the course of the season. We also are going to be having a lot of fun when it comes to potentially doing some live look-ins on Sunday. So a lot of fun stuff going on there. Also ask you to not only support our sponsors in Personam and Potential, but also on the podcast feed, 5-star review if it's out there for you. It really means a lot to us, helps us grow what we're doing here. Andy, take 10 seconds just to say something to people so they know that you're still here.
Oh, at the end of the day, Adam, the very simple answer is we are now through the part of the offseason. We have closed the chapter on that. We're going to get into some of the offensive line signings. Van Roten is one of them that has huge ramifications for who's going to be starting week 1 for the Giants. We'll get into that as the week goes on. But yeah, I mean, it was a peek behind the curtain. It was fascinating. My one question that I walk away with is every front office look like this, or is it just the New York Giants? Yeah. That is probably what we'll find out next offseason when the next team gets to do all this fun stuff.
Hard Knocks offseason should be all the teams in the NFL, not just one, because it really makes you look potentially bad. We will continue to break down all things Big Blue here on OGP, but until the next time, until the best times, as Andrew Mackwitz would want, need, and demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.